This is something that was sent to us by one of the Tupac fans, and I just wanted to spend a little bit of time and go over it and let you know that this is something very compelling. We'll dig into it and unpack each one of these interesting things that we're about to listen to.
Hello, my name's Dave Emery. This is For the Record program number 227, and this is going to involve an examination of an LAPD corruption scandal that is rapidly spreading, and we're also going to take a look at some of the implications of this, or possible implications of this, for the O.J. Simpson case. This segment is excerpted from the One Step Beyond program of April 26th of the year 2000.
So let's think about what was going on in the year 2000. Back then, we had the Rampart Scandal taking front stage. Rafael Perez, David Mack had been arrested. Things were bubbling up, and we were starting to learn more about what was going on at the LAPD back then.
A story, I should say, that's been occupying a lot of space in the Los Angeles Times. It's been occupying some space in other newspapers, but not nearly as much in other papers as the LA Times, and not enough in that one, has been a huge and growing scandal involving the Los Angeles Police Department. We've spoken about the LAPD and institutionalized corruption coming from the direction of the intelligence community in RFA number 9 about the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, in RFA number 23 about, among other things, the criminal conspiracy section of the LAPD, and also in a number of not miscellaneous archive shows, but For the Record segments dealing with the O.J. Simpson case. There are areas of overlap between these various things, including the fact that the person in charge of the crime scene at Bundy, at the scene of the murders of Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson, was a woman named Connie Dial, née Connie Malazzo, who had worked for the LAPD intelligence unit that was basically the successor of the criminal conspiracy section. That was called the PDID, the Public Disorder and Intelligence Division. That was a unit which was involved in, among other things, the Western Goals spying scandal in the early 1980s, in which officers associated with, among other things, PDID and the security for the 1984 Summer Olympics were involved with collecting political intelligence on people in Los Angeles, not criminals, but people with whose politics they disagreed. They were conducting the spying in conjunction with a private intelligence outfit from the far right called Western Goals. They were taking this information and giving it to Western Goals to put in their computer banks and a matching computer bank in Germany. Connie Dial, née Connie Malazzo, married John Dial, who was a member of the criminal conspiracy section involved with the series of events described by Louis Tackwood in the Glass House tapes. Connie Dial then, according to Donald Freed, the co-author with Raymond Briggs of Killing Time, was an individual who had infiltrated the L.A. left, had become a respected member of the L.A. left, and was viewed with great favor, and as one who'd done good work by the, quote, progressive, unquote, section in Los Angeles. It turned out that she was a spy for the LAPD's intelligence division. Among her previous resume credits was the Corriere della Sera in Italy, a CIA-sponsored newspaper. And again, Connie Dial, née Connie Malazzo, was in charge of the crime scene at Bundy, one of a number of connections between the intelligence community or elements associated with the intelligence community and the O.J. Simpson case, and one of a number of intelligence connections running between the LAPD and the intelligence community.
Now, where else have we heard about intelligence operatives working for the LAPD? Well, let's go back to Michael Rupert and his showdown with the CIA at a city council or town hall meeting, and we see that CIA operatives have been working inside the LAPD for quite some time. Listen to this.
Director Deutsch, I will refer you to 3 specific agency operations known as Amadeus, Pegasus, and Watchtower. I have Watchtower documents heavily redacted by the agency. I was personally exposed to CIA operations and recruited by CIA personnel who attempted to recruit me in the late 70s to become involved in protecting agency drug operations in this country.
Michael Rupert is referring to the operations that involved drug trafficking and money laundering by Freeway Ricky Ross and Blandone that were exposed by Gary Webb and Michael Rupert at the time of, it was really like 1995 that the articles ran. So that's what was going on at the time Death Row Records was at its peak. And 1996 was bubbling up as well, and that's the time that Tupac Shakur was murdered.
We're going to touch on the O.J. Simpson case in, later on in this program. But first I'm going to cover some of this enormous and not consummately important, but incredibly important scandal that is engulfing the Los Angeles Police Department and which has enormous implications, not only for Los Angeles, but beyond that for the rest of the United States, California in particular. Research credit on the following goes to a member of the listening audience who gleaned this from the Los Angeles Times of Thursday, February 10th of the year 2000. This is an article by Scott Glover and Matt Late, spelled L-A-I-T. It again is from the LA Times of 2/10/2000. It's headlined, LA Police Group Often Broke Law, transcripts say, subtitled Probe. About 30 officers, including supervisors, celebrated their shootings and frame-ups of innocent people, according to informant statements. I would add this should not come as all that much of a surprise. Not only does this kind of thing happen in other police departments, but none other than Mark Furman testified about this under oath while being investigated by the LAPD, or examined by the LAPD in connection with an application for an early retirement. I would also note that the McKinney tapes entitled Men Against Women were broadcast on worldwide television, and Mark Furman was bragging about exactly this type of activity. We're going to come back to that later.
And now I'm working on 6 cases of innocent men that are sitting in prison, put there by corrupt cops. And I just want to make it clear, I support the innocent men and women that are sitting in prison that are innocent of the crimes they were convicted of. I also stand with all police that honor their oath of office. It's been said by a couple of former corrupt cops that are now charged with drug trafficking and money laundering that I am anti-cop, and that could not be further from the truth. I am anti-corrupt cop, but I love the men and women that are in law enforcement that honor their oath of office. And we need police. We need good police, but we don't need corrupt cops. And the innocent men and women that are in prison that were put there by corrupt cops, they need to have all of their cases looked into, and they need to be freed from what they've been charged and convicted with.
We read as follows, again from the LA Times of 2/10/2000, page A1 by Scott Glover and Matt Late. Disgraced former officer-turned-informant Rafael Perez has told investigators that an organized criminal subculture thrived within the Los Angeles Police Department, where a secret fraternity of anti-gang officers and supervisors committed crimes and celebrated shootings by awarding plaques to officers who wounded or killed people.
This culture was also going on at the Compton Police Department. And in the Snoop Doggy Dogg murder trial of Philip Waldemariam, we know that it was Compton Police and the LAPD that were intimidating the witnesses in that case. That was also bubbling up in 1995 and early 1996. And we also know from the Soledad O'Brien and Ice-T Fox thing that the argument was happening between Suge Knight and Reggie Wright about who knew Rafael Perez, David Mack, Kevin Gaines. And one thing we know for sure, because Kevin Gaines was Sharitha Knight's boyfriend, obviously that was not Suge Knight's contact. And so we're learning quite a bit about these nefarious police officers that were working behind the scenes at Death Row Records, and they were also planting evidence and putting people in prison that were innocent.
The more than 30 current and former Rampart Division crash officers who were in the loop, unquote, including at least 3 sergeants, conspired to put innocent people in jail and to cover up unjustified shootings and beatings, according to transcripts of Perez's interviews with LAPD detectives and Los Angeles County Deputy District Attorneys, copies of which have been obtained by the Times. The nearly 2,000 pages of transcripts, covering months of interviews with Perez, coupled with hundreds of other official investigative documents obtained by the Times, portray a police scandal far more serious than officials have previously disclosed.
And one thing that we know from Rafael Perez's testimony, when we look at mentions of death row records, he denied all involvement with death row records. He also shielded David Mack and his partners from any liability at the Rampart Scandal. And he used his testimony to go after his enemies that were inside of the LAPD, and that resulted in many Board of Rights inquiries. And Kenneth Bogney was used as a witness to clear those officers, because Kenneth Bogney testified that Rafael Perez made things up on those officers so that he could get even with them.
More than 70 LAPD officers are under investigation for either committing crimes or knowing about them and helping to cover them up, according to one document produced by members of a special task force probing the scandal. Perez has told police and prosecutors about a string of potentially unjustified police shootings, including one in which he witnessed an officer place a gun on a dying suspect and listened to a supervisor delay an ambulance so that the officers could concoct a story to justify their shooting of the unarmed 21-year-old man. In another, Perez describes his fellow crash officers as, quote, sneaking up, unquote, and opening fire, unquote, on two New Year's Eve revelers who were shooting guns into the air but posed no direct threat to the police. Perez said some officers specialized in certain kinds of misconduct. One sadistic officer liked, quote, to thump people, unquote, he told investigators. Another planted guns on suspects, while another, known as the Candy Man, liked to put rock cocaine on his unsuspecting victims. Sometimes, Perez alleged, officers orchestrated the deportation of undocumented immigrants who witnessed police abuses and could have testified on the victims' behalf. Quote, I'm going to make a very broad statement, and you're not going to like it, Perez told authorities 2 days after agreeing to a plea bargain on drug theft charges. Again quoting, I would say that 90% of the officers who work crash, and not just Rampart crash, falsify a lot of information. They put cases on people. It hurts me to say it, but there's a lot of crooked stuff going on in the LAPD, unquote. And skipping down, during about 50 hours of interviews with investigators, Perez paints a vivid picture of his personal journey from gung-ho rookie to corrupt cop.
And right about the time all of this was bubbling up, the Compton Police Department was shut down for corruption, and yet nobody ever looked into the cases that were touched by those corrupt police officers.
He talks about the first time he stole money from a suspect and his first foray into drug dealing. In that 1997 case, Perez said, he and his partner, Nino Durden, D-U-R-D-E-N, found a plastic bag containing a pound of powder cocaine on a suspect and seized it. Quote, we kept that. We didn't book it, Perez told Deputy District Attorney Richard Rosenthal, one of the task force prosecutors. Back at the station, the suspect's pager, which the officers had confiscated, went off. Perez called the number, pretending to be an associate of the dealer, a common police ploy in which officers set up the deal and then arrest the would-be buyer. In this case, the caller wanted 1/4 pound of cocaine. Perez made the arrangements, and he and Durden hopped in their undercover black Thunderbird to go make the arrest. But according to Perez, quote, when we first got there, Durden said, screw it, let's just sell it to him, unquote, and I completely agreed. The partners kept the dealer's pager and did 2 more deals, netting about $10,000, Perez said. They hid the drugs in a green igloo cooler in the cot room at the Rampart station. What ensued, Perez said, was an orgy of corruption in which the partners seemingly broke the law as frequently as they enforced it. They didn't even trust one another, according to the testimony. When they were shaking down suspects, Perez was suspicious that Durden was keeping more than half the money. In other words, he was skimming off the top of what we were supposed to skim, unquote, Perez told investigators. Perez said Durden initially did not know that he was stealing kilos of cocaine from department evidence facilities, but that his partner was envious when he found out. "I want in on it," Perez quoted Durden as saying. "Hook me up," unquote.
And Perez definitely hooked Nino Durden up. If you look at Rafael Perez's testimony, he testified quite often against Nino Durden and implicated Nino Durden in all kinds of illegal activity. Be wary of people that are jealous of you, because when they have a chance to hurt you, they definitely can. And Rafael Perez definitely hurt Nino Durden.
And once again from 2/10/2000 LA Times, we read, "Gang members were stripped naked and dropped in rivals' territory. In one mass frame-up," Perez alleges, crash officers rousted a party and ordered several dozen gang members to their knees. He said that Officer Brian Hewitt, Hewitt, who has since been fired from the LAPD for a station house beating for which he may be criminally charged, marched back and forth, randomly pointing at gang members and instructing fellow officers which false charges each would face. After finding a gun on the ground, he told an officer to handcuff Rafael Zambrano, Zambrano, to whom Hewitt allegedly said, "Lil man, you're through. I'm going to violate your probation," unquote. Hewitt then allegedly turned to another gang member called Laughing Boy and said, quote, "You're lucky that I didn't see you before I saw Lil Man. Otherwise, I'd be taking you to jail," unquote. These practices were accepted and protected by those LAPD officers and supervisors, quote, "in the loop," unquote, Perez has told investigators. Protecting those secrets, Perez said, meant having a willingness, quote, "to take it to the box," unquote. What's the meaning of "take it to the box"? Detective Michael Hohen, a corruption task force investigator, asked Perez during a September 17, 1999 interview. Quote, "Take it to the box" is saying that I don't care if Officer Perez gets arrested, he will never get in front of a DA and in front of an internal affairs supervisor and say this guy did this and this guy did that, unquote, Perez said. Quote, "And you know why he wouldn't do it? 'Cause he's been right there with us. He's done it all before." He's right there. You see what I'm saying? Perez asked, seemingly oblivious to the irony of his current situation.
And so what are some of the other things that Rafael Perez took to the box? Well, he took to the box that they were involved in the Biggie Smalls killing, because they were there at the Peterson Automotive Museum, and he kicked those shell casings to corrupt the crime scene. He also took to the box that they were in Las Vegas the night that Tupac Shakur died. And he also took to the box all of the involvement that he had with David Mack. That was one of the cops that he protected in all of his testimony. And so Rafael Perez, he goes after those cops that he had a problem with as revenge, and he protects those cops that he was tight with, that he did nefarious things with. And Rafael Perez talks about home invasions, there was robbing of drug dealers with money and all kinds of stuff. And those are the same things that were rumored to be happening in Compton, with two cops that have been now charged out of Tennessee with drug trafficking and money laundering that were also involved in the Tupac and Biggie murders.
At Rampart Crash, by the way, that's capital, all in capitals CRASH, it's an acronym, beginning again, at Rampart Crash, where the motto was, "We intimidate those who intimidate others," unquote, Perez said an officer learned very quickly that he is expected to fall in with the rest of his colleagues. In fact, even to join the unit, the other officers have to personally sponsor, unquote, or vote in a new member.
And who was another crash officer? That would be Greg Kading. And Greg Kading says that he worked on the David Mack bank robbery case. No wonder the money was never found, and these officers all conspired together, and this is part of the cover-up that was perpetrated by LAPD. Because coming clean with all of the corruption that happened with Rampart and all the other crash officers that were corrupt would have meant paying out hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, or, in the case of Biggie Smalls and Tupac Shakur, billions and billions of dollars, and that would have bankrupted the city of Los Angeles.
Again quoting, "We have a round table, and we discuss this person," Perez said. We talk to people who he's worked with and find out the type of person he is," unquote. Once in the unit, all eyes are on the newcomer as the rest of the group determines whether he is trustworthy enough to be, quote, "in the loop," unquote. Women officers, Perez told investigators, generally could not be trusted. He referred to one partner as a weaker link, unquote, because she was female. Perez added that crash cops who were regarded by colleagues as solid or stand-up guys were not the ones who were by-the-book officers. Rather, they were officers who would be willing to perjure themselves, plant evidence, and fabricate probable causes for searches to put gang members and other presumed criminals in jail.
And we learned from the Toros Ramos case that Greg Kading was one of those kinds of officers. He was in the loop. He was willing to perjure himself and to change the testimony in order to garner a conviction. Is that the kind of person that you want to trust when it comes to hearing the truth about the Tupac and Biggie murders?
Several Rampart sergeants condoned, even participated in the framing of innocent people, Perez told investigators. "Before I arrived at Rampart Crash, I never put a gun on a person. Never," Perez told investigators. "When you get to Rampart Crash, this is something that you're taught. This is how it goes," unquote. That sort of lawless policing produced big results for Rampart Crash. Officers brought suspects in by the carloads, Perez said. In one interview with Perez, LAPD Sergeant Luis Segura seemed incredulous that officers would be able to haul so many arrestees on trumped-up drug charges without supervisors scrutinizing their reports. Quote, "I mean, it seems to me that red flags should be going off," Segura said to Perez. "I know what you're saying," responded Perez, who lunched on pizzas during interview sessions. Again quoting, "All that was cared about was numbers. All they cared about was that at the end of the month, all they cared about was that at the end of the month was how much total narcotics was brought in, how much money, and how many bodies. That's all, really. That was the only concern," unquote. Even officer-involved shootings seemed to receive relatively little scrutiny by the station's upper management. Some supervisors, Perez alleged, were even in on cover-ups. He said Rampart Crash officers use a secret radio code that allows them to broadcast information about officer-involved shootings and other matters without alerting fellow patrol officers in the division and command officers. The clandestine code, Perez said, is particularly useful when a shooting needs to be, quote, "fixed," unquote, to cover up an officer's improper actions. "Here's how we were trained when I got to Crash," Perez testified. "If there's an officer-involved shooting, no one, but absolutely no one, not the lieutenant, not the captain, is allowed to come into the scene. You create some kind of diversion, something. Quote, 'Sir, we still got suspects running. Stay here for a second. We've got officers searching,' unquote. And what's really going on is they're discussing what's going on. Whoever's involved in the shooting, directly involved shooter-wise, will talk to the supervisor, and they will figure out everything. The game plan," unquote. "And you're saying you learned this when you joined Crash?" asked Rosenthal, the prosecutor. Quote, "This I learned when I joined Crash," Perez said. Again quoting, "If we need to add something to the story to make it look a little better, that's what we do," Perez added, again quoting, "If we need to correct something, then and there, before we have the officer-involved shooting team, lieutenants and captains and everybody showing up, we fix it and correct it right there. And we always say that once we come up with a story, that's the story. That's it. You never change it. That's it, no matter what." Unquote.
And these Rampart Scandal cops were knee-deep in bed with the corrupt Compton Police Department. And two of these cops have taken plea deals in a drug trafficking and money laundering case out of Tennessee. And these cops were involved with the 6 cases that we have of innocent men that are now sitting in prison. And every case these 2 men touched, as well as the cases that the Rampart Scandal officers touched, all need to be looked into. And we're going to do that over the number of coming months.
Perez said he helped cover up 3 unjustified shootings in 1996.
So while these guys were attending death row functions in 1996, they were covering up shootings and participating in all sorts of nefarious activities. And that's why all of the cases that were touched by these 2 corrupt cops must be looked into. And it's time that everybody look into these cases, because innocent men have been sitting in prison for decades.
Such shootings did not trouble Rampart crash officers, Perez told investigators. In fact, he said they were celebrated. The officers gathered and drank beer and candidly talked about their misdeeds. They even handed out awards. Quote, "The plaque that you probably saw in my house, you know what that plaque is even about? That crash plaque with a red heart and 2 bullets in it?" Perez asked the investigators. "Sergeant George Hoops, Hoopes, gave me that plaque for the Ovando shooting. That's what that is. We give plaques of playing cards out when you get involved in shootings. If the guy dies, the card is a black number 2. If he stays alive, it's a red number 2. "Is it more prestigious to get one that is black than red?" asked Detective Mark Thompson. Quote, "Yeah, I mean, the black one signifies that a guy died," unquote, Perez said. While Perez spoke in detail about the alleged crimes and misconduct of his fellow Rampart officers, he offered mostly anecdotal evidence of wrongdoing by officers outside the division. Perez said he and other cops would trade war stories at the Shortstop Bar on Sunset Boulevard, or at, quote, "the benches," unquote, at the police academy across from Dodger Stadium. Now, note some of the divisions involved in this. Quote, 77th crash and Rampart crash get into a shooting. We talk about how things went down, how they really went down, and how they were fixed up," unquote, he testified. Note the 77th Precinct, the crash unit, and we're going to come back to that right now. This is from the Los Angeles Times of Friday, March 31st of the year 2000. This is another article by Scott Glover and Matt Late, L-A-I-T, of the L.A. Times. It's entitled, "L.A.'s Police Corruption Probe Spreads." So note that the probe is now spreading to other precincts. Note which ones. The Los Angeles Police Department's corruption probe has spread beyond the boundaries of the gritty Rampart Division and now includes alleged crimes and misconduct in at least 3 other areas of the city, according to interviews and documents obtained by the Times. Internal police and district attorneys' documents show for the first time that authorities are exploring allegations that crimes or misconduct occurred in the LAPD's Central, 77th, and Southeast divisions.
And so Murder Rap is the unofficial LAPD cover-up of the murders of Tupac and Biggie. And you can see that because these emanate from a crash officer named Officer Greg Kading. This is the cover-up. This is limiting the exposure of the LAPD in the city of Los Angeles so that they don't have to pay out billions of dollars. And they put a cap on all of this corruption. But there are thousands, perhaps, innocent men that are sitting in prison, and every one of those cases need to be looked into. And we're going to start with the 6 cases that we've been looking into more later.